God, the piano hits so hard every time. Man, this is so hard to start. Not only is Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda series one of the most famous video game franchises of all time, spanning 35 plus years of history, it's also one of YouTube's most analyzed and retrospected series. Countless people on Susan's poop seat have taken a crack at these games, so what more do I have to add? Well, probably not much, admittedly, but I love this series so much, and with its 35th birthday this year, I wanted to celebrate, so I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring. Alternatively, I could have also said Bombs the Boomerang, Rocks, Crates, Pots, or Den's Fire maybe. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was the first 3D entry in the Zelda series, and it was basically the Nintendo 64's big blockbuster of a game at the time. It came out after a lengthy development for the Nintendo 64 on November 21, 1998, which is actually less than a month before I was born. I didn't actually grow up with this game at all, really. It is very special to me, though. During the summer of 2016, I got my first real job, working at the concessions place at my local pool, and the first thing I bought was this game, just in time to channel my hype for Breath of the Wild's official announcement into something. But was that hype even worth it, really? I mean, this game is super old. Sure, it may have been the best of the time, but is it even worth picking up now, in a world where the old Zelda formula has basically been totally eclipsed? Well, let's travel back in time and figure that out in this Ocarina of Time long-form review. Okay, so I'm going to do some bragging real quick. When I said I bought this game, what I meant was I shelled out for the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. This was a promotion pack that got used differently in different regions. In the US, it was used for GameCube bundles as a reward for subscribing to Nintendo Power or for registering your console. You're going to be hearing about this quite a bit over the next few videos because it not only contains Ocarina of Time, it contains a bastardized port of Majora's Mask. And trust me, we will get to that. And also, it has a multi-part demo for the Wind Waker, as well as a trailer for the at the time upcoming game. I'll flesh out those last two games' deals later, but for now, let's also focus on the disc's other features. The original NES Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link are also on here. Will I ever finish them? No. NES games like these are sensory overload for me. I'm not hyper-focused enough to put up with these gremlin games. The disc does have a video that shows off every Zelda game released to that point and a little montage with a nice main theme remix. It's simple, but this pack just exudes this massive passion for the series it's promoting. Each of the 4 games show this little blurb that feels like something you'd see in a magazine ad or on the back of the box. Regardless of how I feel about any of these games, these get me hyped up because somebody's building it up in a way that just works for me. And the trippy background and artwork accompanying each game really tie it all together. Mwah! An excellent old game collection if I do say so myself. Okay, enough of that. I'm gonna just real quick name my guy here. Just give me another second. Yeah, that should be fine for 20 hours. The game starts with a brief cutscene in Link's nightmares, establishing the good guy, the bad guy, and a sense of mystery surrounding the scene. We get quickly introduced to the Deku Tree, Navi, and the idea of Link being the chosen one, and we're then sent off to explore the forest. While the text speed is in and of itself a total killjoy when it comes to this game's story presentation, an issue whose big lanky shadow looms over the whole game, the cutscenes themselves do a pretty good job getting the player all excited for what's to come. The framing and layouts of every sequence in the game make important characters feel important, and you can tell that making use of the third dimension and using dynamic camera motion was important to the team though I wouldn't say it ever gets distracting at any point, which is really appreciated. I'm not trying to get nauseous while I'm playing Zelda, you know what I mean? After the story stuff, it's up to the player to go find themselves a sword and shield in Kokiri Forest, which is a good incentive to force them to learn how Link controls in 3D. Nowadays, it's easy to finish this opening section in a few minutes and dive straight into the first dungeon because every veteran player knows where the sword and shield are and can quickly rack up some rupees with all the usual tricks. But let's look at it from this perspective. Let's assume that the number of people on planet Earth who have had experience controlling Link in a 3D environment is 0. Okay, that's the assumption that the designers had to build this section from, and so to get the players to engage with all those brand new mechanics, they made 2 simple objectives that encourage a lot of different button presses so the player can get all the basic actions down. To get the sword, the player will learn how to crawl through holes using the context-sensitive action button, will most likely learn how to center the camera to see around corners, and use the action button again to open a big chest, and they'll also most likely learn how to roll when trying to outrun the perpetual motion machine that is this magic boulder. Once they get out of the maze, reading the signs outside of it will give them some idea of the moves they can use with the sword. They'll have to really figure it out during the first dungeon, but it's good that there's a non-lethal area for them to at least try things out in. To get the shield, they'll first have to enter the shop and learn how to navigate the shop's inventory, which will inform them they need to collect some rupees. Ooh, the hunt is on. They'll learn about running through grass, tossing stones to get items out of them. There's the stepping stone place that rewards the player for getting the hang of the weird auto jump, and there's the always never not harrowing bridge above the forest that will help them learn how touchy the control stick can be. Getting either of these key items requires opening the menu and manually equipping them, giving somewhat of an idea of how equipping the normal items will work. On top of all that geniusness, you're locked to a small playing field. The one kid doesn't let you leave the forest because the Kokiri can't survive out of the forest after all, and Mido is your real incentive to explore since he won't let you progress the story until you show him your equipped sword and shield. The game does still allow you to stumble into the Lost Woods before you're meant to, presumably because you can collect some rupees there, but it's nice that it keeps the player in the right locale without screaming at them to stay on track. It turns lesson time into a miniature version of the real thing, while also stacking on the charm of being in a village of adorable elven children. The music fits that vibe perfectly and helps keep things feeling as playful as the Kokiri themselves. All in all, I would consider this a near perfect tutorial area, as it's a breeze for returning players who want to get a move on, but a nice playground of introduction for players not used to 3D Zelda's controls. The introductory dungeon, the inside of the Great Deku Tree, is also really fantastic. If you didn't bother with learning combat up until this point, boy howdy, you're gonna learn now. The path leading to the dungeon introduces actual lethal enemies, but they're stationary and only hurt you if you touch them. But as soon as you step into the dungeon, there are versions of these plant guys that will lunge at you and try to take a bite out of you. The dungeon is split into the vertical climb up the tree where you get the dungeon map, which lets you view the entire layout of the dungeon. The compass, which lets you see your position on the minimap, shows you which door you entered from, and lets you know where all the chests are and where the boss door is, and the slingshot, your first item. It does all of that to teach you the basics of dungeons and teaches you some other basic actions that the forest couldn't, like climbing walls, stepping on switches, using your first few items, diving, going through doors to disguise loading times, and moving blocks. It also gives you a better grasp of the full range of the abilities you already knew about. For example, the room where you get the compass has you jump across these timed platforms to get to the chest, and also to reach this side area where the first gold skulltula is. Also, yes, I say skulltula. Okay, that's just how it's gonna be, and I don't want to hear from any linguistic professors in the comments. The other things this dungeon handles well are the use of the first-person perspective, as it's used for some light shooting puzzles with the slingshot, which gets you used to viewing the world through Link's eyes, which is used again at the end when you have to look up to start the boss fight with Goma. It uses verticality well too. I think climbing all the way to the top and then diving down to bust open the webbing is seriously one of the slickest puzzles in the game. It's not explicitly explained to you, the most you get told is that there's more below it. And the torch logic puzzles that make up most of that basement section are really great. The boss with Goma might be a total pushover, but aesthetically it's a scary first monster encounter. I mean, a huge dark room with a humongous spider and that's it? Free key. I mean, I can barely handle it when a moth flies in my room IRL. And then you get your heart container to make your health grow a little bit, and you're out. Pretty much the only thing the dungeon gets wrong is Navi explaining literally everything to you before you even get the chance to mess around and figure things out. But again, with this being one of the first games of its kind, I'll let it slide. Navi isn't even that intrusive. People need to stop complaining about her so much. Afterwards, the main things of interest are the Hyrule creation story, getting the first spiritual stone, your main MacGuffin for the first part of the game, the Deku Tree dying, and Saria saying goodbye and giving you the Ocarina. At this point, Link enters Hyrule Field and the game begins proper. There's some story stuff to go do right away, but I'll get to that stuff later. So what are the important chunks of this game? Link is obviously at the forefront. A lot of time went into all his actions and control. He also comes with all his items attached, so that'll be a whole thing. Exploring the world using those actions is also a huge chunk. There's the towns and the other areas to engage with, but there's also the huge Hyrule field to explore as well. So basically we just need to dive into the whole world presented to us, which will include a story summary. The dungeons are their own beast in terms of exploration and interactivity, and are where the story naturally funnels you into. So we'll go over all those too. Also, there's the obligatory presentation section. The graphics and music are important. Alright, we're already 9 pages deep. Screw me. Let's dive in, gamers. Link controls fine in this game. Not the best he's ever controlled, but not as awful as it could be. And the main reason for that is that the Nintendo 64 controller made simple, flowing movement in this 3D space pretty much completely impossible for a few reasons. I'm one of the people who thinks the N64's controller layout is outdated and even at the time wasn't all that great compared to the simple and ergonomic layout of the original PlayStation controller, and then it got objectively obliterated into the stratosphere when the DualShock was released a few years later. And I know what you're probably thinking, it can't be that bad on your version since you get to use the GameCube controller, which freaking rocks. Well, it is a lot more comfortable, however, this is not a modified port, it is a fully emulated port. In order to keep things as the same as before as possible, the C buttons from the N64 controller were mapped to the cardinal directions on the GameCube's C stick. This is fine for the most part, although it does have its hangups like causing some directional confusion at times for certain items, and sometimes the stick interprets the wrong direction while playing the ocarina, causing the wrong note to be played. There is a workaround, as the X, Y, and Z buttons can be used in place of the C left, right, and down buttons, which I prefer to use. The game never tells you about that though, and it's a shame they refused to tell the player about a far more comfortable control scheme and instead settled for putting far less effort into this port. Oh sure, yeah, we can change the button icons from green to red, but adding text, oh, come on, don't be silly, don't be ridiculous. The GameCube's control stick is one thing about the port's overall controls that is a massive improvement. The N64's revolutionary analog stick is really stiff and barely has any range compared to any later stick I have ever used in my whole life. In the GameCube port, I feel I have far more of a handle on Link's weighty motion, especially the auto jump. That was a big subversion of gaming conventions at the time. 2D games almost always had a jump button, and top-down games often didn't require them as part of the gameplay. However, as platformers were all the rage at this time, jumping was seen as one of the infallible conventions of gaming, so throwing out the idea of a jump done with a button was a bananas idea at the time. It's been well implemented and well used here, and it keeps the game from melting into being a game that unevenly splits into platforming and puzzle parts. Anyways, the control stick being more wieldy makes sure you have as much control as possible over Link's midair momentum, which helps a lot with the semi-tricky little leaps this game is full of. Link's mobility overall is very well handled, especially when targeting. I wouldn't say that Link's default speed is awful, but rolling and jumping are good options for dodging attacks or getting around more quickly, and like I said, the auto jump has been well developed. The equipment system itself is perfectly functional, allowing players to have any 3 items they want on their person at a time, even if I wish they'd explained it a bit bit better. The only place this game totally fumbles is in anything related to the camera. In third-person mode, you can only center it by pressing L. In combat, hitting L is used to lock onto enemies so that you can focus on them without them jumping all around you. But when you're just walking around, the camera has a bad habit of either not staying behind you or drifting above you like it got bored and started floating away. Having only a single way to manage it in the form of a button press is not that helpful. And don't even get me started on first-person aiming. At best, it's way too sensitive, so it takes you forever to center your shot. At its very best, you're using the hook shot, which has an aiming reticle so you actually know where you're about to hit before you fire. At its worst though, the aiming is super sensitive with no reticle, and it snaps back to the center when you let go of the control stick. Thank gosh for the L targeting, because it takes any pressure to actually try and aim off of you. But when it comes to puzzles, most of the time you will have to manually aim, and man, that is the absolute worst. Items are a Zelda staple. They're a bunch of different doodads that allow Link to use new abilities for traversal and puzzle solving. They're usually dolled out at a set pace, so you can use the new ability to go back and do things you couldn't before, using your short-term memory to try and remember that there was something you couldn't do before. And Ocarina of Time has a lot of them. The Deku Nuts can be used to stun enemies on the fly. I never use them, but they might be helpful for newer players trying to catch a break. The Deku Sticks are a little more interesting, as you carry them as a sort of portable make-a-torch, since you can light the end on fire and carry the flame over your head. Unfortunately, any use it has after the Great Deku Tree is kinda just a rerun of whatever they already did, and adult Link can't even use them, so it's not like the challenge has the chance to evolve into something more complex. The first mind-blowing item you get is the Fairy Slingshot. You also can't use it as adult Link, but it gets quickly replaced with the Fairy Bow. They both serve the same purpose. They let you shoot a straight shot at a faraway target. Again, the first-person aim is very janky, but shooting switches or foes with this can be fun once you get the hang of it, and sniping a Z-targeted foe in the face is endlessly satisfying. Bombs are probably one of the most used items in the game, since you can obviously blow things up with them like rocks, walls, or even pesky enemies. They're a pretty universally great item since they're so versatile. Even if they don't evolve at all, the bombs are a reliable adventuring tool, so that's not really anything to complain about. It's always enjoyable to suspect a secret and see the thing blocking your way to it burst into polygonal chunks. And I'm not just talking about me after Taco Bell, okay? The boomerang is, it's like that hook shot on training wheels, since it can pick up things and bring them back to you, but even though it's useful for picking up extra goodies as young Link, it has its only good uses as a puzzle tool in Jabu Jabu's belly. That's about what I'd also say for the Megaton Hammer, which is probably the worst item in the game, since it's not even that fun to use in its own dungeon, the Fire Temple. It's literally just a hammer. Like, this... Bro, thinking about this is giving me a headache. The hook shot is one of the best Zelda items ever. By shooting a chain out, you can grapple onto surfaces and either pull them back to you or pull you to it. Its use in combat is limited since it can only go one direction at a time, which is honestly really hilarious whenever it happens. But for exploration, it's a freaking perfect item. And it gets even better when you get the long shot, doubling its length, allowing you to pretty much zip around anywhere. God, I love the hook shot. The Lens of Truth is a weird one. It lets you use magic power in order to see through false objects. Things like fake walls or floors or invisible targets are prominent in a couple areas, and even though it's obviously a level gimmick, I don't know, I like it. It's a good gimmick, and it doesn't overstay its welcome or anything, so, you know, whatever. The Lens of Truth is a fine item. There's a set of identical items that are just as great as the bombs and hookshot, and they've got my vote for possibly being the best Zelda items ever. The empty bottles. There are 4 total in this game. 1 is mandatory in the story, 2 are pretty easy to get if you put in some effort, and the last one takes forever to get and is part of one of the lamest side quests in the game. More on that at 11. Empty bottles can be swiped to store a number of items in them. Recovery potions, fairies that revive you upon death, dead people, and bugs. Then you can use its contents whenever you want. It's such a versatile and unique type of item that I always love getting no matter when I get it, and I feel like how any given player uses bottles can be used more accurately than an astrology chart. Like, For example, I pretty much exclusively use all of them to carry fairies, which probably betrays how terrified I am of dying. Those are all the main items, but there's a few others we can talk about that are more or less just miscellaneous things. The magic spells based on the 3 goddesses are essentially portable buffs that you can use whenever you want if you have enough magic power. Din's Fire allows you to send out a flame burst around you to help with enemies or make some fire puzzles way easier. Furor's Wind can make convenient warp points to specific rooms in dungeons, and Nehru's Love can make you invincible for a time. These may sound overpowered, but since it's a reward for some tricky exploration, and in the cases of the former 2 are hugely convenient, I don't really care. There's also the equipable tunics and boots. Link's iconic green tunic does nothing. The red tunic makes you immune to extremely hot areas, so basically you only need to use it during the fire temple, and the blue tunic lets you breathe underwater, so basically you only need to use it during the water temple. Like I said with the Lens of Truth, these are level gimmicks, but they can make Link a customizable fashion icon. And don't forget the boots. The iron boots make you heavy so you can sink underwater, and the hover boots decrease your traction but let you hover over pits for a second. Oh, and you can't forget about the gauntlets. You get the silver gauntlets towards the end of the game, allowing you to push bigger blocks than previously, and then at the very end you get the gold gauntlets, letting you toss pillars in this snazzy animation. And hang on. We can't not talk about the mirror shield, which lets you reflect and aim beams of light. It's pretty cool. It lets you reflect beams of light. Yeah, all these ancillary items are all level gimmicks, but they're not super intrusive or unfun to use or anything. Well, except the iron boots. The water temple taints the thought of them for the rest of the time. But other than that, they're all interesting things used to flesh out this fantasy world and just get another unique idea into the game. None of them take anything away from the game. They just add a more than healthy dose of variety, so I don't mind them. But you may have noticed there's one major item that I've neglected to mention so far. The ocarina, baby! Yeah, it's my favorite item in the game by far. At first, it's the fairy ocarina given to you by Saria before you dump it in a moat so you can carry around the Ocarina of Time, I guess. You can really tell that Link and Saria are best friends. But when you use the ocarina, everything freezes and you get to play notes on it using the C buttons and the A button. This gets fleshed out quite a bit throughout the game because there are multiple melodies Link can learn to solve puzzles or perform different tasks, all written using those 5 notes. Koji Kondo, the soundtrack's composer, says that writing all these songs using only those notes is one of the biggest composing challenges he's ever faced. After you learn a song in the game, you'll have to play it to see the effect take place. You can look up the melody in the menu, but you're still going to have to remember it yourself when you actually go to play it. It can take some time to memorize them all, since that's a lot of specific button combinations. It could even put Tekken to shame. But since Koji Kondo did such a great job creating such memorable tunes, it's actually pretty easy to get to grips with it by sounding it out. I'd say he even made sure that the songs kind of scale in difficulty in a way. All the songs you learn in the child era are a 3-note pattern that repeats twice. Pretty easy to memorize. You learn the first half, you already learn the second half. Then once you're used to that, all the adult era songs are 5 to 7 different notes. Pretty neat. I like all the different uses for the ocarina as well. Zelda's Lullaby is used as sort of a fill-in-the-blank for puzzles. Well, wait, that makes it sound like a cop-out. It still feels satisfying to use since it's contextualized as a way for people associated with the royal family of Hyrule to make themselves known. The Sun Song is very useful when hunting for the gold Skulltulas and accessing time-specific areas, since it can switch between daytime and nighttime on a whim. Epona's Song can be used to summon your horse to your side. All the adult era songs are used to warp near each of the main dungeons, which can make doing side quests way more convenient since you don't have to walk everywhere all the time. The weakest ones are the Song of Storms and Saria's Song, since they only have one-time uses for puzzles in the overworld, but they're obviously still catchy melodies. There's even a place where you can write your own song. By talking to these scarecrows in Link Hylia, you can have them memorize your own 8-note melody, and then if you play that in specific spots, Pierre the Scarecrow will pop up as a hookshot target, creating some shortcuts for you in certain areas. I didn't get very complex with mine, but I could have, obviously, which is the whole point of mechanics like this. All of this effort being put into one single item makes the Ocarina by far one of my favorite Zelda items of all time. And we haven't even gotten to play some of my favorite songs on it yet. Overall, you can tell that so much effort was put into Link as a playable character. His base moveset is well executed, even if how you're forced to put it in view isn't very successful, and all the special abilities you learn really make the world feel like a slowly unraveling puzzle box. As you get more items, you can explore more of the world, and it really helps you feel more powerful as the game goes on. So, how is the world itself as a sandbox? The world presented to you in this game is okay, pretty great in some respects, pretty lame in others. Either way, this series has produced better worlds in the future. I think the most notable thing about it is the layout of the world. It's more or less a big circle with all the major sub-areas and towns being placed around the outside, the obvious exception being Lon Lon Ranch in the very center. I would say that Castletown and Kakariko Village are the best towns because they connect to the rest of the world in a logical way, and they have enough buildings and people that they feel like places that are real. Castletown especially has all these fun little games you can take on, like the shooting gallery, which sucks because of the aiming, and the Bombchu bowling alley, which sucks because bombchus suck, and the treasure chest game that's only fun because you can use the lens of truth to cheat your way to the end. That's such a fun twist on the most gambling-based game in the town. Kakariko may not have any mini games, but there's the House of Skulltula, which you can check out for prizes during the Gold Skulltula hunt, and you can help this chicken lady get her chickens back during the child era, which I found to be a ton of fun. Unfortunately, the other main towns don't have a lot going on. Goron City and Zora's Domain are fine to run around and check out on your first visit, but returning to them isn't that engaging other than seeing the vaguely different layout of the Zora's new icy digs. Lake Hylia is pretty nice as a small, barely populated corner of the world. It feels like someplace you'd find on a Midwestern background. Yeah, you know which ones I'm talking about. It has some like kook working his own weird business, and it has a fishing hole where you can take a break and do some fishing. Honestly, it's a pretty mediocre minigame, but as an aesthetic thing here just to flesh out the lake, it really adds to the experience. Lon Lon Ranch is also believable as a ranch. Actually, I have a cousin whose family owns a few horses and has a chicken coop, and yeah, this is fairly accurate to the real deal, just on a smaller scale. Plus, Malin's here and she's the best girl, so obviously I love hanging out here. What about Hyrule Field itself, though? Well, the music is great, obviously, but as an explorable space, it's kind of empty. Yeah, there are things in it, like patches of choppable grass, trees, the terrifying pea-hats, and rocks to blow up. There's also plenty of holes that have little goodies in them, which are fun to check out. Usually it's just money, but if you find some heart pieces, oh baby, getting 4 of these will give you an extra heart, so looking out for these is extremely useful so you can be overpowered by the end of the game. They can be used as rewards for pretty much anything because they're always rewarding to find. And there's also the many fairy fountains that you can stumble onto and get health boosts and fairies whenever you need. But at the Great Fairy Fountains, an amazingly confident giant woman shows up and gives you a new skill or buff. This is where you can get the spin attack proper, dense fire, and double your magic power, for example. A majority of these secrets are hidden behind obstacles that you'll be able to bypass the further you get in the game using new items, so at the very least, Hyrule Field is worth exploring so you can stick conspicuous spots in the back of your head for later. But the geography just isn't interesting at all in the main part of the field. There's exceptions like the Path Up Death Mountain, Gerudo Desert, and the Path to Zora's Domain, which are designed as little linear paths that are more like Mario levels, if you ask me, so they have inherently more interesting layouts. Gerudo Desert especially has so much going on the path to the Colossus, but the main part of the field feels so flat. It's not literally flat, obviously, but it might as well be with how little there is to mess around with. Later games have a way better take on the Hyrule Field concept. Aside from all the little things and little games you can discover which flesh out the world as an inhabited space, there are several dedicated side quests that fill out the world as a space with inhabitants. The main ones that come to mind are the Epona side quest, Happy Mask Shop quest, the Big Goron Sword trading quest, the Gold Skulltula hunt, and the Big Poe hunt. Despite what you would think from the promotional art and the title screen of the fucking game, Link's horse is actually totally optional. For those that complete the quest, however, not only does it feel fulfilling enough to do that it feels more like a mandatory type of optional, but getting the horse is so useful in getting around, especially in later parts of the game, that you pretty much have to do it to not have a rough time during the adult era. So, during the child era, you meet Malin and later encounter her again at Lon Lon Ranch. When you talk to her a bunch, she'll eventually teach you Epona's song, which causes her best friend horse to finally take a shine to you. When you return as an adult, Ingo will only let you ride the horses for a minute if you fork over some cash, and when he sees you summon Epona over to mess around like true best friends do, he'll wager some more money on a couple races. They're not the toughest thing ever, although he can screw you over by getting in front of you, so if you get stuck behind him, there's pretty much no chance you'll pass him again. That's really the only annoying thing about this quest. If you lose, you have to give him 50 rupees, meaning you'll probably have to grind some, since by that point you'll only have a max of 200 anyway. A big annoyance, but you'll be running circles around him in no time despite that hiccup. This pisses him off so bad that he locks you in the ranch, and you have to outsmart him again by turning around and jumping the back wall like one of the hurdles. It's such a great sequence of events, and afterwards, you have your own horse. Overall, despite the small issue with the rupees that might set some players back, it's a great quest that's well worth doing. The Happy Mask Shop quest is kinda hard to explain, so just stick with me for a sec. When you're a kid, there's this shop in Castletown that sells masks. Except they don't actually sell the masks, they give it to you to, just have, and you have to put it on and talk to everyone to figure out who really wants it. And they'll give you the money that they think it's worth, which sometimes the amount it's the amount that the shop was asking for, and sometimes it's more so you can keep some profit, and sometimes it's less, you have to pay out of your own pocket, and sometimes your 200 capacity wallet is full from the outset, so you can literally only lose money doing this quest. On a logical level, this quest is obviously weird in a number of ways. Not only would a shop never give goods to random kids and tell them to find the people who want it most, not only could Link easily lie to get more money out of every single buyer, not only would all these buyers try to stiff Link right back regardless of his offerings, but why would Link bring any of that money back to the store? I know you have to bring back the money to get the next mask in the lineup, but I feel like after spending all day hassling everybody about his stupid new key something mask, Link would get frustrated and give up. But I think the implication is that the Happy Mask salesman is a weird guy who wants to give people in the world happiness in the most backwards way possible. I think all the logical inconsistencies kind of add to the charm of this quest, because despite how much of a nightmare participating in this kind of shop would be in real life, you do effectively make several people happier by doing it. It's the character interactions that make this a memorable quest. The guard in Kakariko wants to buy the Keaton mask for his kid, Skull Kid and the Graveyard Boy want the skull and spooky masks to feel scarier, and El Pentissimo over here wants the bunny hood because according to legend, it can make you run way faster. It doesn't actually work, but I think there's a fan theory that eventually he becomes a very fast guy. Even regular NPCs have over-the-top and memorable reactions to you putting on a mask. This quest is weird, but it's bursting with character, so it's another good one as long as you're not in it for the money. The Big Goron Sword is an optional weapon that you can get by doing this game's trading quest. It's a sword that's so big you can't use your shield when it's equipped, but it's stronger than the Master Sword itself and has a longer reach. It basically turns you into a glass cannon, which is one of my favorite playstyles, and it makes bosses, especially Morpha and Bongo Bongo, a breeze. The trading sequence getting to it is a mixed bag though. Figuring out who to talk to and where to take stuff is tough at points, so using a guide is definitely the best way to do this one. Doing that also helps when you're given a time limit on delivering certain items. Don't get me wrong, I love a good speedrun, and rushing across Tyrol Field and up Death Mountain at the end was a heart-pounding challenge, but if you don't use a walkthrough, you'll just assume the best way to deal with the timer is to warp, which instantly makes you lose, making you have to repeat this step. Oof. And then at the end, you have to wait a few days for the sword, so you have to either go do something else and come back, or you can play the Sun Song and wait for the time to change like 6 times. Either way, the character interactions, speedrun segments, and end reward make this more worth it, but having to figure out where to go and who to trade with is more than a bit obtuse at times. I think the whole ordeal could have been overall improved with some quest markers of some sort, and just cut out the waiting at the end. I get what they were going for, but after all the running around, just give me my dang sword, Big Goron. Also, yes, the sword is named the Big Goron Sword, after the character Big Goron, who is a big Goron. Can you tell this game was produced by Shigeru Miyamoto yet? The Gold Skulltula quest is a long quest you'll be working on from the first hour until literally the final hour of the game. In Kakariko Village, there's a house filled with these horrible spider-human Cronenberg things who say that they've been cursed. So obviously the only way to break the curse is to kill all these Gold Skulltula things and nab their tokens, all 100 of them. In return, at certain milestones, one of the 6 dudes will be turned back into a human, and they'll give you a reward. You know what I'm trying to say, I'm not going to re-record that. So first things first with this one, the Gold Skulltulas themselves are generally fairly well hidden and fun to look for. They have a very distinctive audio cue that plays whenever you get near one that just begs for you to drop everything and look around for it right this second. Some of them are really obscure and aren't that fun to hunt down, but it's fun to try and figure out how to reach some of the tokens or what circumstances cause the spiders to rear their ugly mugs. And since they're spread throughout all the game's areas, you can take your time to hunt for all of them at your own pace, so it's not overly frustrating unless you make yourself look for all 100 all at once for some reason. That sense of leisurely intimacy you get with the world around you as a result of these types of quests makes it well worth participating in. The rewards do not. So like I said, you get a reward at different tiers of the quest, so you'd think they'd be evenly spaced out, like 1 reward per 20 Skulltulas, right? Or if not that, there'd be a pattern like 10, 20, 40, 60, 100, or whatever. Well, guess what? You get a reward for every 10 Skulltulas up to 50, and then you don't get another reward until you get the last 50. Very uneven pacing. What about the rewards though? There's a couple different wallets at different tiers, one that goes to 200 rupees and then one that goes to 500 rupees. Technically these rewards suck because in the larger discussion of this video game, the wallet shouldn't be a limitation of any sort in Zelda. It always blows if you ask me. But in terms of this quest, they're very helpful rewards that are nice to get from doing it. You also get the Stone of Agony, which vibrates whenever you're near a secret that isn't apparent in any way. You get some bomb chews, which are these weird explosives that can ride over walls and stuff that are required for like 2 puzzles, and that's it. That reward blows. And then at 50, you get a piece of heart, which is whatever. And that's it until you get all 100, at which point you get 200 rupees every time you talk to the guy in the center, which is the lamest reward of all time. Now I stopped after 50 because playing Ocarina of Time already takes forever doing all the other stuff. Plus I have to write this video, which is like 70 pages, and then I have to edit this video, and Lord knows how long the whole thing's gonna be. Not to mention I am so fucking depressed right now, so things that aren't inherently rewarding in any way at all aren't super appealing to me at the moment. I will say that this is a great idea for a long-form side quest that I really admire. It just sucks that they couldn't brainstorm any really worthwhile rewards. The Big Poe hunt involves you shooting at ghosts in the future Hyrule field, bottling up their souls, and selling them to this creepy guy in town. Give him all 10 of the Big Poes, and you get an extra bottle for your trouble. I found this one to be overall the least interesting major side quest. Not only is it very repetitive, it's also padded out. You're only going to be able to bring the guy a max of 3 Poe souls at a time, and that assumes you can find the Poe's spawn points without any trouble and zap them all on the first go around as well. It just takes forever, and having another bottle is nice, but it doesn't feel very worth it for all the boring sniping you have to do. Listen to that boring sniping. How do you even pull that off? Time is hugely important to this game, if you couldn't tell from it literally being in the title. It plays a huge role in the narrative too. When it comes to exploration and the gameplay at large, however, it has a big effect in 2 main areas. there's the day-night cycle, and there's the splits between the child era and the adult era. Let's talk about that one first, since it's easier to discuss. The two eras can be switched between by interacting with the Master Sword's pedestal. The differences are obviously prominent to the story, since there's a 7-year gap that goes by every time you jump between them. People are in different roles or look way different due to 7 years passing by, and it's always fun to see what's changed. Plus, now you can finish some quests or unlock stuff that you got going in the child era and can be further interacted with now. The Epona quest and the Scarecrow song are the prime examples of this. There's also the magic beans. So in the past you plant these beans, and then in the future they turn into platforms that can carry you to formerly out of reach secrets. This kind of interplay between the past and future is really fun. Sure, it's not all consistent with each other, like the big paradox where the windmill guy teaches you a song he heard from Link in the past, because after you learn it from him now you go back in time and play it for him in the past so he's mad about it in the future. But I'd say that the team's goals with all the time travel stuff in general was to create opportunities where the two eras interact with each other due to your actions as the player, regardless of if it's all compatible with each other or creates plot holes or space-time wormholes or whatever. It's all charming and fun, especially the windmill puzzle. That shit's hilarious. So maybe this fun Nintendo game doesn't need to have Doctor Who level discourse maybe. Actually, let me backtrack on that statement a tiny bit. The story aspects and era interactivity are all well and good, but there was a huge missed opportunity that there aren't more pedestals to swap between within the world. I know the item selection wouldn't really make it that interesting as the game is now, but being able to flip-flop between the two areas within dungeons would have been pretty neat. The Spirit Temple is technically the only dungeon to do this, and even then it splits the dungeon into halves instead of a time interconnected whole. That all being said, with the team trying to figure out what a 3D Zelda game even is, and trying to make as many uses out of a few assets as possible, I can see why doing that with the dungeons and creating both past and future versions of them wasn't feasible. So this is just a lament for an idea that will never come to pass. The day-night cycle is interesting to me as a mechanic because the thing is, it doesn't really need to be here to make the experience all that. The only things it meaningfully has an effect on in the entire game is waiting for the big Goron sword, which sucks, and the sunrise you shoot an arrow into to get the fire arrows. Sure, most things in the world are dependent on what time of day it is, like shops being open and gold skulltulas being out and about, but time doesn't need to pass of its own accord for any of those things to happen. In fact, time only passes on its own in the field areas. It stops in every single town, and you can bypass the time flow with the sun song either way. And I know what that whole last paragraph sounded like. I'm saying words that sound critical of the mechanic, right? Well, like people say, there's a difference between a need and a want, I guess. Like, time doesn't need to pass on its own, but I want it to because of all the cool touches it adds. The shops closing down for the night, the gold skulltulas, the unique skyboxes, sound effects, and nocturnal enemies popping up, and the running man taking a break at nighttime to rest in the monster-infested grass. None of these things had to be in the game for it to be well structured or designed, but it's part of why this game is as memorable as it is. This is a feature that's become commonplace in games to this day because Nintendo wanted to make the world feel that much more alive and they went for it. I think this is one of the main reasons that I'd say Ocarina of Time is still worthwhile these 20-something years later. So cool. And I'd also say the dungeons are a huge part of that appeal even today as well. Since I know a lot of my friends are the main people watching these things, Caitlin, Lacey, Hadley, glad to have you here. Glad you made it this far in the video. Let me explain what a dungeon even is. In Zelda, there's sort of these self-contained puzzle boxes that exist contextually as ancient ruins or caves or whatever. There's locked doors that require keys to be opened, puzzles, overlapping pathways, and it all builds to a climactic showdown with a big monster at the end. Dodongo's Cavern, the second dungeon in the game, is a good demonstration since it has an overall linear path, although it feels very twisty and turny since you go back and forth across the main room at multiple points. It's the individual room puzzles that carry this one, since the path to the end is pretty easy to follow. That's fine though, since this is one of the earlier dungeons, and regardless, those contained puzzles are really fun to think through. The bombs get tons of fun, explosive puzzles here. The showdowns with the Lizalfos that appear throughout the dungeon in these two connected rooms give nice little brain breaks where you just get to focus on the fight. Pretty much the only weak part of this dungeon is the boss, King Dodongo, since his attack phase is easy and his defensive phase is even easier. His fight's even easier than Goma's, which I think makes him definitively the most pathetic monster in the game. Even the bats in this dungeon do more to get at you than he does. Jabu Jabu's belly is a bit more non-linear, and I really like that puzzle at the end where the first inner room you enter gets reconnected to, so you have to realize you can use a box from that same room to open the door. But it falls a bit flat for me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's really short, and second of all, Ruto is an annoying character. And I do mean in general, because she falls down a hole so we can have a sitcom level wacky conflict, and then she has the gall to make you carry her around, but she's also annoying as a gameplay mechanic because you have to carry her around. You can't attack while doing this, and if you get hit you drop her and she fades away and goes back to the previous room. All you can do is avoid things, set her down on switches, and toss her. Is it better than a traditional escort mission? In some respects, yeah, but having her warp back to the first room that you got her in every time you drop her or whatever is just as inconvenient, if not more so. The aesthetic of the dungeon, while distinct, is kind of gross for obvious reasons. The mini-boss is a really obnoxious kind of back and forth and goes on for way longer than it should. The enemies in this dungeon are all aerial types and can fly away from you or into you way too easily. Overall, it's not a very enjoyable dungeoneering experience. I think the boss really rocks though. It's fast-paced and constantly changing things up on you, so its brisk pace makes the relatively short fight memorable and a lot of fun. And the fourth wall break with Ruto initially getting the spiritual stone is hilarious. Those, along with the aesthetic, are the most memorable parts of this dungeon, but obviously from all my complaints, you can tell that I enjoyed this one the least so far. The first dungeon in the adult era portion of the game is where things start to get really great. This dungeon introduces a more complex and overlapping layout, meaning you'll really be checking the map to figure out where all the keys are. That's another new element first introduced to the game in the Forest Temple. Small keys, which can be used to unlock any old normal doors, and the boss key, which is stored in a special chest and is used to access the final room of the dungeon. It also represents a good step up in the difficulty of the fights, as all the enemies found here are more aggressive and do more damage. The puzzles and use of 3D space are also more complex and really get you looking around and trying to figure things out. Overall, this feels like a dungeon that knows you get the basics by this point and wants to start pushing you a little bit harder. The atmosphere in this temple is second to none. It feels like an old rundown manor, and it feels like a living person hasn't been here in decades. The main goal of hunting down all the Post Sisters keeps you on edge as you don't know when they'll pop out, and the haunting ambient track that samples Link's voice clips is pounding in your ears the entire time, putting on even more psychological pressure. Haunted forests are one of my favorite aesthetics, admittedly, but regardless, everything just comes together here to make a great whole entire meal of a dungeon. The weakest part, and it's really not that bad, is the boss, because the camera doesn't always work with you when you're trying to counter his fast-moving attacks. But other than that slight oversight, the boss is wicked creative and scary, fitting in with the rest of the Forest Temple. What a high-quality capstone to the first half of this game's dungeon selection. The Fire Temple is another solid one. Piecing this one together using the map was a really enjoyable time. The layout itself was just really cool. I weirdly really liked just looking at the map and figuring out my path forward. The individual room puzzles were kind of lame as puzzles, since they were mostly all hit the switch and run to the right place in time kind of deals. But I love me a good speed run, so that's more than okay with me for one dungeon. It's like they created the entire dungeon with an emphasis on pathfinding on both a macro and micro level, and I think it worked out great. Except for this one bitch-ass puzzle at the top of the temple. So what you're supposed to do is hit this switch and run up the staircase before the timer runs out so you can reach this chest that's engulfed in flames. The only hitch is if you jump off the right side of the stairs, you fall all the way down to the second floor, meaning you have to go out the door, walk over to this switch, watch the cutscene, run to the wall, climb the block, get lifted by the block, and only then can you try this challenge again. It's not too bad, and I've got the hang of it now. But the first time I played this game like 5-ish years ago, I literally fell off these stairs like 15 times, and it was so annoying. And before you ask, yes, I did try both the Scarecrow's Song and Furore's Wind, so I could either cheese the stairs or the climb back to the stairs, and neither of them worked. I think the atmosphere in here was really great on the whole, though. I always love the thick, dense atmosphere that comes with lava-themed areas, and this temple really nails it. Light brown bricks and bright reds light up the rooms that are full of flames and boulders, while silvers and dark teals dominate the much cooler areas. I think the overall tension is pretty great, and it works with the pathfinding to create a great narrative sequence. You're in here to save the imprisoned Gorons, so you bust them out one at a time at a pretty consistent pace. The bigger combat encounters are also pretty nice. The two mini-bosses are fun diversions. You're told to toss bombs at them to dissipate their larger body, but I learned the hammer will work in a pinch, and I just think their tinier body that scurries around the room is the funniest crap I've ever seen. And Volvagia is, yes, I'm saying it that way so I don't sound like a pervert. Volvagia is a pretty easy but memorable fight as they float and twirl around the arena. They never hit you, but they're definitely intimidating and well animated. Plus, the death scene is brutal as all get out. Another very solid dungeon. Alright, just to drum up some tension before we discuss the Water Temple. There are several mini dungeons throughout the game. These are exactly what they sound like, shorter dungeon-like areas. They're so short, in fact, they may or may not have a map. The Ice Cavern is one of them. It has some nice atmosphere for an ice level, and a couple nice puzzles with the supernatural fire, and it introduces the silver rupees. The enemies here may be annoying as hell, but the whole thing doesn't go on for too long, so that's not that big of a deal to me. The bottom of the well is explored as a child to get the Lens of Truth for exploring the Shadow Temple. It's actually got a fairly short mandatory path, which culminates in probably the freakiest boss concept in the game. After that, though, you can use the Lens of Truth to see through fake terrain and hunt for a ton of optional stuff. Even though constantly falling down to the basement is absolutely obnoxious, using the Lens of Truth for secret hunting is a lot of fun. The Gerudo Fortress is probably my least favorite part of the entire game. I'm not joking. Not only do they not give you a map to help you get around this surprisingly labyrinthian place, it's also a stealth section. With this game's awful camera controls, it's very unclear whether or not you'll get spotted by accident, which sends you right back to square one every single time. So this place definitely overstays its welcome. And that really blows because I absolutely love the Gerudo as a clan in the Zelda series, but they absolutely ruined their own area by having unclear vision zones and a tedious crawl through the fortress. At least you get to listen to the sick Gerudo Valley music while you piece it together. That kept me from going totally insane anyways. Speaking of the Gerudo, after you, for some reason, rescue all the men from the fortress, the Gerudo make you an honorary thief. And after you finish the Spirit Temple and have the tools for the job, you can enter a totally optional dungeon that serves as their training grounds. It's a lot of fun. Your reward for doing it may be the ice arrows, which really don't have any practical use in this game at all, but the rest of the dungeon leading up to it is great. Since it's about training, this isn't really about navigation. It's about every individual room, which all feel different from each other. There's combat, platforming, musical puzzles, silver rupee challenges where you need to collect 5 of them to open up the path forward. They're always great, by the way. They pop up multiple times throughout the game, and they always keep you moving and learning the space. But getting back to the training grounds, the variety leads you to really feeling like a true member of the Gerudo's ranks. I love this place. Okay guys, it's time to talk about the Water Temple. I wonder what scathing and insightful commentary I can give about this place. In terms of the reviewer opinion spectrum, we have our boy Matthew Matosis, who said that the Water Temple is the worst dungeon ever. And on the other end, we have our ASMR chap King K, who says that this is his favorite dungeon in the game. I'd say I'm somewhere in the middle, and I'm probably closer to Matthew Matosis. I think this dungeon has a pretty great path to the end that's satisfying to solve on paper, like listed out in a wiki walkthrough, for example. But I think the dungeon's actual layout makes it impossible to remember where any of these fairly enjoyable puzzle rooms actually are. and that makes it hard to remember where the water level adjustment spots are as well. You know what? Everything about actually playing this dungeon is inconvenient, actually, especially in the N64 version. A lot of issues are fixed by the 3DS remake, admittedly. In the N64 version, you have to remember which of the 3 spots will change the water level to which floor, and if you want to put on the iron boots to sink down to the submerged floors, you have to pause the game and switch between them and the normal boots, and then unpause every single time. In the 3DS version, the water spots are all color-coded according to their respective floors, and you can just tap a touchscreen node to switch out boots. But still, I remember this one conversation I had with some old geezer at my church, back when I still went to church, and he said, and I quote, "The water temple isn't that hard. You just have to switch the level and then check all the rooms until you find the way to go." Which, like, I get that, but that isn't all that fun. And all the dungeons' other inconveniences really make me want to not do that at all. Plus, the atmosphere is generally uninteresting. The music is great, sure, but everything is well lit and it all looks very homogeneous throughout. Really, the only highlight of it is the Dark Link room, which fades mysteriously away after you defeat the illusion. And that's the only moment that sticks in my mind from this entire dungeon. Speaking of Dark Link, what a wasted concept. If you just go into it with a normal sword, you cannot land a single blow on this butthead. But if you come in with the big Oron sword or use Din's Fire, which, by the way, the room outside supplies you with plenty of magic power to do just that, you can absolutely clown on this illusion. See, look, I just showed you the entire fight. Oh my gosh. The boss of the dungeon does a lot of damage if it nabs you, and it being a creature reminiscent of the Blob is a neat concept, but actually fighting this thing is annoying because of the stop-and-go nature of the hookshot. Overall, I appreciate the effort put into this dungeon's path, puzzles, and unique mechanics, but actually trying to have any fun with this one just isn't gonna happen for me. It's too annoying to have any fun doing the pathfinding I really liked about the past few dungeons, and that makes it stick out like a sore thumb. Hopefully the next one makes up for it by being great, lol. Oh wait. The Shadow Temple is a weak dungeon for pretty much specifically all of the exact opposite reasons that the Water Temple is a weak dungeon. Whereas the Water Temple is annoyingly obtuse and has literally no atmosphere, the Shadow Temple is annoyingly straightforward and lays on the edgiest possible atmosphere ever of all time. I know they're trying to portray it as a monument to Hyrule's bloody past of war and tyranny and stuff, but the more you stop me to put a text box on screen to remind me about that, the more I don't care. The item here is the hover boots, which reduce traction and allow you to run over pits for a few steps. That means the only real puzzle solving has to do with the Eye of Truth, and that's literally like you look at something and you know what the solution is. You get the map and the compass within like 10 minutes of starting, and looking at the map will show you that this thing is literally a straight line with a few detours on the way to the end. I remember from my first playthrough that Bongo Bongo wiped the floor with me a bunch for some reason, so while the linear layout may not seem like a bad thing at first glance, the more you die to this guy placed at the end of the path, the more you have to walk the entire linear path just to get to the end, and the more it starts to grate on you. The Spirit Temple has a fairly linear path like the Shadow Temple, but it's still more complex, has a level gimmick that helps it stick out, has some fun story moments within the actual dungeon itself, and has way better atmosphere than either of the previous 2 dungeons. The dungeon is split into 2 halves that can only be explored by the 2 Links. The child half isn't very complex or long, but having to use young Link's smaller and more limited arsenal again is a fun challenge, plus you have to fend off enemies that only adult Link has faced to this point, which is really intimidating since you're less powerful. The adult half makes use of more items and makes more complex versions of some of the puzzles young Link had to deal with. For example, there's these unique enemies that mirror your movements, and you need to get them into a spot that will set them on fire to progress. There's a simple version of this puzzle as young Link that only uses 1, but as adult Link there's a room you step into and suddenly there's 3 of them that all mirror you in different ways, and you need to get them to 1 fire spot. Or you could be a bitch like me and just use Din's Fire to cheese it. Still, having this dungeon do things like that and make use of your whole arsenal and keep adding new items makes it interesting to progress through. The atmosphere is great. The Water Temple was too 1980s bright, and the Shadow Temple was too 2000s dark, but the Spirit Temple has this sort of lighting that makes it feel like an ancient ruin. The music works excellently here to create that sort of droning, contemplative desert atmosphere. It gives me the same sort of vibe as the Fire Temple, from a slightly different aesthetic and emotional angle. I just love hot themed areas in video games, I guess. But I think the best part of the dungeon is the mini story it tells within itself. Here, Child Link meets Niburu, a snarky Gerudo who hates Ganondorf's methods of pillaging and murder and wants to use her thief skills to take him down from the inside. Unfortunately, she can't crawl through the hole because she's too big, so she gets you to go through the dungeon and promise to give her the treasure in exchange for some reward. Link does that, getting the silver gauntlets, but it turns out that these witches have made Niburu vanish into the ground using their magic. This ups the stakes considerably. Returning as an adult, you can use the silver gauntlets for yourself to push the larger blocks and enter the second half of the dungeon, and upon reaching the top, the witches introduce themselves as the intimidating Kotake and Koume, and get the third iron knuckle of the dungeon to fight you. The iron knuckles rock, by the way. You can provoke them to attack you in a number of ways, which is very different from how most other enemies work. I think that combat normally has a fine, if a little annoying, flow. It's not the core of the experience, so it being a little undercooked never really bothered me that much, especially in the first 3D Zelda game ever made. But this guy keeps the fighting fast-paced and is always trudging towards you. Plus, you can have them knock that scenery over for some hearts if you need. Pretty great. But it turns out this Iron Knuckle was a brainwashed Niburu, who has apparently also lost the last 7 years just like Link because of being locked in the armor. Wait, so were the other ones other locked up Gerudos? That's effed up. I freaking hate old people now. After this, you take the witches head on, using the mirror shield to reflect the fire and ice beams at the other one. Their second phase, where they combine into a giant lady, has you absorb 3 of one type of beam and zap them with that to demobilize them. This one is the boss that gave me the most trouble because I forgot that you need to put the big Goron sword away to be able to use the shield again. I thought the beam collision was just being wonky, and I got my only game overs in the entire playthrough from this one because I'm an idiot and couldn't remember how the moveset worked. Whoops. Anyways, after they get in a pretty hysterical sibling squabble and then God yanks them away from this mortal plane, the dungeon finishes. The mini story is enough to make this dungeon one of my favorites, and like I said, even though the path is more or less linear, the atmosphere, some of the puzzles, and splitting this baby in half really make up for it. There's also this final moment with the owl where he pops in at the end of the child half and says, "You fully matured and the world is depending on you now," which I think could have been better placed at the very beginning of the adult era if he said, "You are maturing and all the world is depending on you now." And since it takes place right before Niburu gets napped, which is kind of a big shame. Regardless, I'm glad this set of dungeons ends on a high note. On the whole, I think this is a fantastic set, even if it has some duds. They're all distinct and all have at least 1 or 2 highlights, even if it's just the item you get there. If I had to pick my absolute favorite, I think I'd say the Forest Temple. It's the best overall package in my opinion. Okay, this is the story discussion part of the video, so here we go. First, I'm gonna sum everything up so we're all on the same page, but I'm gonna try and do it really fast because as you can tell from the length of this video, I really respect your time and also my time. Okay, so like I said at the start of the game, Link is having prophetic dreams about the dark future of Hyrule, which he will play a part in. The Deku Tree senses that the time has come for him to get going with all of that, so he sends Navi the Fairy to be his companion. This is significant because Link is the only Kokiri not to have gotten his fairy yet. Normally that's not so bad for him, except that Mido actively harasses him and makes him feel like an outsider. Anyways, Link goes inside the Deku Tree to fix the curse that's been plaguing him. Link wins, but unfortunately he got started too late, I guess, and the Deku Tree dies right in front of him. Before that happens though, the Deku Tree explains that the curse was put on him by a guy from the desert, and also explains that a long time ago the 3 goddesses worked together to create the world and left behind the Triforce. After this, Link goes to Hyrule Castle and sneaks inside to meet with Princess Zelda, who says she's also been having prophetic dreams. She says Link having the green spiritual stone, which he does have that by the way, means that he'll save the world. Also in the throne room, the creepy dude from the desert, his name is Ganondorf, remember that, is here, and he's gonna steal the Triforce and destroy the world. So the thing about the Triforce is that it'll grant any wish of the person that touches it, it, but like with most relics like this, it's saddled with the trope that it can't tell good from evil. That means Link has to help Zelda in preventing Ganondorf from breaking into the Sacred Realm where the Triforce is kept. They have to do this by getting the red and blue spiritual stones, and then using the titular Ocarina of Time to get into the Sacred Realm. Are you still with me? So Link goes and gets the other spiritual stones from the Gorons in Death Mountain, and the Zoras in Zora's Domain. The Gorons are dealing with a food shortage because their cave full of the best rocks got sealed off and full of monsters. Could they fix that problem by eating other rocks or using their own bombs to open the cave? After you clear out the monsters, Darunia, leader of the Gorons, says he respects you and wants you to be his sworn brother. Link doesn't know what that means, but he takes the red spiritual stone. In Zora's Domain, King Zora says that his daughter, Princess Ruto, has gone missing after visiting the currently restless guardian deity Jabu Jabu, so he lets you go look for her. You know, and eventually you get to. After getting her out of the fish, Ruto says that she was impressed and that she's only supposed to give the blue stone to whoever's supposed to be her fiancé, and she gives it to you. Link doesn't know what that means, but he takes it anyway. After this, Link tries to go revisit Princess Zelda, but the scene from Link's earlier dreams comes to pass. Zelda and Impa are riding away from Ganondorf. Ganondorf stops and directly asks Link where they went, and when Link tries to stop him, he puts the kid right on his butt. After retrieving the Ocarina of Time that Zelda tossed into the moat from the moat, Link goes to the Temple of Time, opens the Door of Time, and pulls the Master Sword, which steals Link away and lets Ganondorf step right into the Sacred Realm. Turns out some 10-year-old didn't exactly know what she was talking about after all. When he wakes up, Link is now 7 years older, and those 7 years have actually passed as well. Ganondorf has wreaked havoc on all of Hyrule, making everything worse for everybody, and on top of that, Link can't just go stop him. He needs to liberate several temples to awaken the 7 elemental stages. Rauru here is the Sage of Light, and he just gives you his power right away. But there's also the Forest Sage, Fire Sage, Water Sage, Shadow Sage, Spirit Sage, and some other mysterious 7th Sage. After leaving Limbo, a weird guy named Sheik, who is the last Sheikah, introduces himself to Link and reiterates this goal. Link leaves on his new quest and sees the ruins of Castle Town and Ganon's huge tower, giving a clear goal to work towards. After this, the plot becomes more episodic for a while, as you revisit previous areas one at a time, fixing whatever their self-contained problems are. The Gorons have been imprisoned and are going to be fed to an ancient dragon as a power flex from Ganondorf. Zora's Domain and its inhabitants have been totally frozen over, some of them with magic red ice. Kakariko is being tormented by an evil spirit, and the Spirit Temple has become a base for the Gerudo, Ganondorf's people. Also, Sheik teaches you how to warp to all these places whenever you want. One by one, people we already know that are associated with all these places are revealed to be the sages. Saria, your childhood friend, is the Forest Sage. Darunia, your sworn brother, is the Fire One. Ruto, your fiancé, is the Water Sage. Impa, the leader of the Sheikah, is the Shadow Sage. And Naboru, a rebellious Gerudo who hates Ganondorf and that you saved from the Spirit Temple, is the Spirit Stage. And that's the story so far. I'm gonna save the ending for later. So now that we're all on the same page, I would say when it comes to these types of visually presented stories that the 3 key elements are the storyline itself, the script, and the visual and audio presentation. With games, there's also elements of interactivity that can be utilized to give the story the extra oomph it really needs. I think the storyline here is perfectly fine and in some cases very deep on a thematic level. There are some parts that don't matter, like how the world was created and Rauru's existence as a character, but the rest of the story structure is laid out pretty evenly. No plot threads drag on for too long, and they split the game's different acts into digestible chunks that are satisfying to follow up on. If I could change a couple of things, I would change when Sheik teaches you the Prelude of Light as well as the Nocturne of Shadow. Those are such convenient songs to have, and as the structure is now, you can only learn the Prelude of Light when you try going up to the Master Sword's pedestal again, and you can only learn the Nocturne of Shadow when it's time to do the Shadow Temple. Being able to learn those at earlier points, like when you meet Sheik or the first time you enter Kakariko in the future, would make some quests far more convenient. That's basically the only gripe I have with the story structure though. As far as the thematic content of it all, it's obvious that time plays a huge role in it. I'd even go as far as to say the story is about relationships over time, or how much things can change even in a short amount of time. Even though Zelda was trying to protect her kingdom, she was going about it in the most short-sighted way possible. Link was also going about getting the spiritual stones in the most short-sighted way possible, agreeing to deep, lifelong relationships with other people just to get his hands on them. Sure, he earned Darunia and Ruto's begrudging respect / unbridled lust, I guess. But he's just a kid making impulsive, immature decisions. And most of the other adults in the game seem to understand that. You don't have the chance to earn their trust, so they tease you or tell you to bug off. But they don't matter, because right now you're just goofing around and enjoying being on your adventure. In the adult era, you have more direct responsibility, and you're dealing with more serious situations now. It's all on Link's, and by proxy, your shoulders. It can be kind of intimidating because people directly ask for your help and ask more of you than they ever would have before. Even though most people haven't had 7 years ripped away from them, getting older and getting a bunch of grown-up responsibilities can happen in a way that feels like it's all at once. By the end, Princess Zelda, as a character, recognizes this and rips the space-time continuum to ruin Zelda lore discourse forever, but also to give Link his childhood back. Nobody should lose that innocence all at once like Link did. It should be a natural process. I think the visuals and music really add to the emotional punch of this story. I've already discussed the great cinematography earlier in this video, so I won't go on about it too much, and we'll get to the goddess-like soundtrack soon enough, but I just think that they're both done so well, and that they're also the main reason this story is so successful and why it's connected with so many people. It has a surprisingly bittersweet kind of tone, sitting in the middle of being triumphant and being hopeless, that makes one heck of an impression. Unfortunately, the whole thing is delivered using one of the worst scripts I have ever read in my life. Lots of stilted, dry language with very little personality, and it all gets drip-fed to you since the dialogue crawl speed is so slow. That's one of the other things the 3DS version fixes, thank God. Sure, you can skip some lines, but more often than not, that led me to accidentally skipping an entire conversation. Good job, Nintendo. But like I said, a lot of the lines themselves communicate good ideas, just in the most boring way possible. And some of them are outright awful. There's lots of cringy lines. The worst one is this one from the couple in Castletown, as they say, "You're more beautiful than Princess Zelda." Just to clarify, we're in the child era, so Zelda's a preteen. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Not to mention Nabooru saying this after you rescue her. Ugh. I actually like Nabooru a lot as a character, but they give her the dumbest lines to portray her motivations. Sheik always spews poetic nonsense at you that vaguely fits the character you meet in that area, and it always sounds ridiculous. And then there's stuff like Ganondorf banishing the Phantom to the gap between dimensions. Which dimensions are you talking about, buddy? What does that imply about the universe we're in, Paleo? At least with lines like that, I can have a laugh about how serious and grandiose they're trying to sound, but still, I wouldn't blame someone for hating the story itself because of this script. It's that bad. Fortunately, the game still has plenty of charm due to the many characters populating its story and its world. Sure, the dialogue may turn a few of them into nothing more than story dispensaries, but there are plenty of characters that shine because of their animation or their connections to other characters. I mean, they must be fine characters if there's options of who to ship Link with, of which Malin is the best. Yeah, I said it. Again, Zelda's a boring idiot, and Ruto's too invasive and bratty, but Malin not only expects standards from her clumsy dad, but she cares for all the animals in Long Long Ranch, and has a nice singing voice, for 1998 video game standards, to boot. Plus, she actively takes an interest in what Link actually wants too. So yeah, Malin's best girl, fight me. There are plenty of other memorable faces elsewhere in the world. Talon, Malin's dad, is a well-meaning but lazy man who rightfully owns Lon Lon Ranch. His ranch hand Ingo does work harder, but he's a greedy, mean dude. That's an interesting dynamic, and seeing Ingo take over the ranch in the future by scamming people and sucking up to Ganondorf fleshes out the interaction further. Castletown is full of all sorts of wacky characters. Kakariko has this boomer that complains about his gay son. The graveyard has the gentle giant Dumpe give the heart-pounding grave-digging tour during the night. Later on, he dies, and you have to race underground with him to get the hook shot. What the fuck? During the day, the graveyard has this little kid who wants to be like Dante. The Zoras have King Zora and his infamous butt shimmy. The Kokiri have Mido and Saria. The lake has the weird professor guy and the weird scarecrow dudes. In the ruins of Castletown, there's the guy that buys ghost souls, who may or may not be a guard who died in the past. Gerudo Desert has Naburu. You get my point. This game is full of so many characters who may be simplistic and may have awful dialogue, but everything else about them, their looks, gimmicks, or relationships really manage to make them memorable. Some of them even get different incarnations in future Zelda games. And all these characters being so memorable is part of what makes the Land of Hyrule itself a joy to explore, because you never know who you'll get to bump into. As one could infer, the Nintendo 64 was not the most powerful console ever. The thing didn't even have proper sound hardware, for crying out loud. So when I say the N64 could barely handle this game's very basic looking graphics, you best believe me. Sidebar, most well-optimized games run at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second, which helps make sure that the player's inputs have more than enough time to be recognized and properly executed. If a game is really pushing it, a stable 30 frames per second is generally seen as an acceptable frame rate. Ocarina of Time runs at 20, even on this emulated collection. Yeah. Would I say it ruins the game? That's certainly not. It not only is the game for the most part not intensely fast-paced, but all the animations are made with this frame rate in mind. Combat often has this feel of y'all taking turns to hit each other, and most enemy attacks have weighty wind-ups, so you have more than enough time to react. The only exception to that is the bosses, which are all about ramping up the spectacle and tension anyway, so I'm more than fine with that if I have a few fairies to spare, which I always do. Overall though, this game's raw graphics are very dated. I mean, how could they not be? But I want to split my discussion on the game's looks into what I think of the art style and what I think of what they present in the game itself. As seen in promotional art made for the game, Ocarina of Time is going for a very anime-esque look, where realistically proportioned characters have very stylized facial expressions. There are obvious exceptions to the realistic part, like the Gorons and a lot of the enemy types, but I will say that the art style blends all these disparate looks into a cohesive whole, which I'd say is something the Zelda series has always been pretty great at. Yoshiki Haruhana did a great job on creating a group of characters that all looked distinct, but all fit together into this crazy fantasy world. Now, as for the looks of the video game itself, I'd say I like them. Most of the ground textures are pretty bad, especially the patchy grass and dirt of Hyrule Field, and unfortunately a lot of the character designs that I love so much got fairly mangled in the transition to polygonal models. But I'd say that the effects like the lens flares, water, and weirdly the buildings and walls throughout the world save the world's appearance for me. Those all have a great low poly look that I appreciate. And even if the models as models look kind of rough, I think the great animations and some nice facial expressions help these characters feel alive despite their looks. And it's that kind of effort of pushing back as hard as possible against the limitations of the platform they were on that really impresses me about this game's graphics overall. In areas where it's appropriate, they even made use of pre-rendered backgrounds, which was standard practice at the time and even for a bit afterwards with series like Final Fantasy and Resident Evil. Even though these don't look anywhere near as good as the images found on the PlayStation versions of those other games due to further compression, they still help set the scene better than polygons ever could in the places where they're used. So despite the heavy hamperings heaped on the helpless heads of the humble horde of developers, I can't believe I did that in one take, this game does a decent job for its time creating a convincing sense of place and populating the world it presents with memorable looking characters. The graphics themselves may look just okay, but I can tell the effort put in was beyond infinite, and it still works in many respects. That's why the low poly aesthetic is still one of my favorites. Shave off a few of the jagged edges, and I'd love to see a new adventure game really emulate this kind of style. Something that should not be emulated is this game's approach to sound design. Like I've been saying, the team put in a lot of effort on the presentation front, especially for one of their first premier 3D games. But despite the great breadth of sounds they engineered to sell the world that you explore, I can sum up every single one of them with one word: loud. From the hero of time himself, to all the enemies, to all the item sounds, just every sound effect tends to be very in your face and unsubtle. I'm not exactly a sound effect guy, visuals and music are more my speed, so maybe there's a sound hardware history lesson to be had that explains all this. But regardless, all the sound effects in this game are really distracting and even border on causing minor sensory overload for me at points, so at this point in my mini playthroughs I've learned to just tune out most of them, except for the gold Skulltulas because you need that sound to look for them. Alright, it's time for the Ocarina of Time mixtape. This one is very hard to shorten for me because this is one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. Not only can its musical influence be felt throughout the entire rest of the Zelda series to this day, but it also remains a reminder of the staggering creative heights of this era in gaming. I'd say this and Final Fantasy VII scores are the peak of early 3D gaming music. Please do not ask me to pick one over the other though. Koji Kondo was still on a roll as the sole composer for the console Mario and Zelda games, and this was one of the last soundtracks he did all on his own. So all of this being said, it might be easier for me to start by listing the tracks that I don't like. The enemy theme and the boss theme grate on my nerves, especially the normal enemy theme. Both of them want to heighten the tension of fights, but they honestly grate on my nerves and serve to break my immersion. That'll mostly be a recurring theme throughout this retrospective. I'm the only person I know that feels really passionately about hating 3D Zelda enemy songs. The other ones I hate are... actually, that's it. That didn't really help at all. Shit, well, I guess the main takeaway then is that this album is 99% bangers. So what are the real musical highlights? The title theme is somber and sets the tone of this game brilliantly with some quiet introspection. The other most iconic pieces are mainly the ones connected to the Ocarina songs. Zelda's Lullaby, Lon Lon Ranch, The Lost Woods, The Temple of Time, and the Song of Storms are the main examples of these. But the Ocarina Warp songs taught to you by Sheik during the adult part of the storyline are just as iconic. Speaking of chic, the themes used to highlight various characters' appearances all do their jobs admirably. Chic's theme is immediately welcoming, putting your reservations about their mysterious nature at ease. The Deku Tree has a theme that informs you that you're in the presence of a sacred being. Likewise for the themes surrounding the goddesses and the sages. Ganondorf's theme has a bass line reminiscent of the famous Jaws theme song, letting you know danger is inevitable whenever he's around. Kippura Gabora sounds like a well-meaning know-it-all's theme, which means that Koji Kondo had a brilliant understanding of how this character would come to be known before this game even came out. Incredible. And the Witch twins, Kotake and Koume, have a theme that jumps between speakers to represent their sibling bickering. All the area themes are well executed and tell you a lot about the people living there and the culture. I love the Castletown theme, the Kakariko Village theme, which has two slightly different versions for the child and adult eras, the Curiosity of the House theme, the trippy drums used for Goron City, the laid-back feel of Zora's Domain, and the high-energy Spanish feel of Gerudo Valley. Most of the dungeon themes are very simple and ambient, but they manage to grab your attention anyway by how creepy and atmospheric they are. The Forest Temple, Water Temple, Ice Cavern, and Spirit Temple are all standouts. The Fire Temple's not really a standout track on its own, but obviously I can't talk about Ocarina of Time's music without talking about how the original version of the song sampled a Muslim chant off a sound sample disc, which was replaced by a synth voice choir in later versions of the game. I think the Hyrule Field theme is my very favorite one, though. It was actually written not as one linear piece, but as a collection of several different 16-measure songs that could be chained together by the game for different situations. There's a climactic and adventurous section, a very plucky, happy-go-lucky section, a peaceful section that sounds very contemplative, and even a variation for being near an enemy in the field, which is a bit obnoxious, but I appreciate that effort nonetheless. Okay, I think I got all my energy out on this one. I just love this soundtrack so much. Go give it a listen on your own time, and I promise you probably won't be disappointed. Now let's wrap things up and talk about the last section of the game. The end game begins by you meeting Sheik at the Temple of Time for one last info dump. Okay, so the Triforce itself is one relic, but it's actually made up of 3 relics: the Triforce of Power, the Triforce of Wisdom, and the Triforce of Courage. If you have a balance of the 3, you get your wish, but if you don't, it splits into 3. The one you match with the most sticks with you, and the other pieces go to whoever their match is, creating like a destined trinity of people. Ganondorf got the Triforce of Power, allowing him to take over Hyrule. With all his courageous acts, Link gains the Triforce of Courage, and the Triforce of Wisdom belongs to the 7th Sage. Sheik has been Princess Zelda in disguise this whole time. What? Yeah, everybody knows this plot twist now, but it still has some oomph. Zelda was so determined to help you out that she became a ninja. I mean, how cool is that? But now that you have all the sage's power, it's time to go Oh, frick. Ganon kidnaps Zelda and takes her to his tower. So Link busts in there and uses the other sage's power to make a magic bridge to the tower. It's time for the final stretch of the game. The last dungeon is Ganon's tower. In the middle is the actual door leading to the final boss, and we have to bust the seal around it by going into 6 miniature corridors based on the other 6 sages in order to weaken it until it bursts. The formula here is the same in each room. Do the little set of 1 or 2 mini challenges, shoot this balloon thing with the newly acquired light arrows, and get warped back by the area's corresponding sage to the main room. They all have slightly different messages that reflect the relationship with Link, which I think is a cute little detail. The only hitch in doing this dungeon is that there's one final item, the gold gauntlets, which are found in the Shadow Temple's room. You can't get into the Light Sage area or finish the Fire Temple room without that. Other than that, this is a pretty breezy final area that makes use of the more memorable area themes and all your main abilities one last time. Once you enter the tower part though, things get really good. You can barely hear it at the start of the tower, but this church organ kicks in that slowly gets louder and more dramatic, increasing the pace between notes to make it sound more urgent as it goes on. The tension continually builds as you get closer to the top, only made more teeth-clenchingly dense by making you face off with some collections of the toughest foes you fought on your journey. Then you enter the room, Ganondorf himself playing the organ. You wait for him to notice you, but it takes forever, making everything even more queasy. Then he drops one of the few raw lines in the game, talking about the Triforce of Courage. "These toys are too much for you. I demand you return them to me." And then the final battles kick off. This boss fight can be a little tricky when it comes time to swing your sword at him. He starts the battle by creating a huge gap between the outer ring and his platform, so you have to jump across. Missing that jump is a huge bummer when it happens, and it happened, so I was bummed. That's not really a feeling you want to feel in the middle of your game's final boss. I wish the climb back to the top didn't take so long. I think that's the worst part about it. But the rest of the fight is fine. You need to play energy tennis with him, and then zap him with light arrows to bring him down. These main facets of the fight are technically more difficult because he uses dark magic at the start to keep you from targeting him, but I actually think it's a fairly average battle from a challenge perspective. For one thing, not targeting him means you can see a shadow for the energy balls he tosses at you, and for another, it's not that hard to line your shot up way beforehand by standing next to the corners of the arena. Either way, it's at least a satisfying fight, and the music gives it this desperate atmosphere since it has this weird time signature and this haunting vocal synth. After the fight, Ganondorf is so flabbergasted that he lost to some kid that he spits up a green JPEG. Thank God it isn't red, or else this fight would be violent. After this, he blows up the roof of his tower, and although Zelda has been released, the tower starts to fully collapse as a result of Ganondorf's power burst. So you and Zelda start the manic dash for the front door. I think 3 minutes is a more than generous time limit, even with all the rooms you have to run to. Sometimes Zelda gets confused and isn't able to keep up with you right away, but this is still a pretty fantastic set piece. Great way to end the game. Navi even gets a little emotional moment, saying she's sorry she couldn't help in the battle. What a nice end. Oh. Out of the ruins rises a pissed off Ganondorf. He fully succumbs to the Triforce of Power and transforms into Ganon. No silly pseudoscientific descriptor. This is just Ganon, the end-all, be-all evil of this game. After he knocks the Master Sword out of your hand and locks you into a ring of fire, you're forced into combat with this huge beast. Now, can you still use the big Oran Sword? Sure. Can you get him to break pillars to collect some fairies to abuse? Yeah. And is he big enough that you can just dodge him by running between his big pig legs? Absolutely. But the atmosphere of this fight is just perfect. There's lightning everywhere, but Ganon is shrouded in darkness, making him even more horrifying. And the music is the cherry on the ice cream sandwich of this whole showdown. It's so thick. And stabbing Ganon right in the forehead with the Master Sword, dealing the final blow, is one of the most satisfying things that a game has ever asked me to do. Good thing his head squirts green though, otherwise stabbing him in it would have been violent. After the final battle, Zelda and the other sages use their powers to lock Ganondorf in his messed up version of the Sacred Realm. He swears revenge, leaving the future of this timeline uncertain. For now, this timeline is safe though, all thanks to Link's efforts. Zelda has her realization that it was wrong of her to try and control the fate of the world, even if she had good intentions, and that Link having his innocence ripped away from him as a result of her rash decision making was wrong. So she uses the Ocarina of Time to send Link back to relive his childhood. He has matured though, and now it's up to him to regain what was taken from him. Navi even leaves him since he clearly doesn't need her anymore. It's a very bittersweet ending to this game, which fits with the overall vibe the game has. We end on the imagery of Link meeting Princess Zelda again in the past, presumably tattling on Ganondorf and preventing any of this from happening, but at least the future gets an opportunity to exist in peace. Can I make a slight tangent real quick? Thanks. I love this credit sequence so much. It's a nice send-off for both the world and characters. All the overhead shots of all the places you visited are like looking back at the photos you took while you're headed back home from a vacation. And the scenes with all the people of the land partying are not only adorable, but also really sweet as a last goodbye. I love how they use Saria's song as the basis for this scene, since that's by far the most jovial tune in the whole lineup, but then layer the cast Castletown harpsichord, choir sounds, and the Goron City drums on top to represent that everybody in the world is being involved here. All of this before it transitions into the chords from the title screen. Simply beautiful. More games should do things like this more often. It doesn't feel like a lot of them have fun credits anymore besides the music. It's wrap-up time for real now, though. I think it's pretty clear that I have a lot of respect and love for this game. Oh, I'm more than willing to call out and explore its faults and how future 3D entries have a clear set of goals for improvement, but still, as predictable of a final thought as this is, for a first attempt at a 3D action-adventure game in a well-established franchise, and furthermore as one of the first 3D action-adventure games of all time, I think it speaks a lot to the fact that there's still an audience for this game. Anybody can pick up one of the billion different versions that exist, and despite the camera hiccups and the old graphics and the terrible script, find a world to get lost in and a game to be amazed by. I'd say most of the high praise the game received at launch and since may be incredibly overblown, but it's impossible for me to argue that this game isn't still great. And the best part about that is, in terms of the retrospective, this series can only get greater from here. Starting on the highest of highs is pretty impressive, and I'm glad that I can say that about something so close in age to me. This will always be one of my favorites. I'm gonna keep it real with you guys. This video was very fulfilling to put out, but still absolutely exhausting to produce with all the asset making and writing and recording and editing. So I think this Zelda retrospective will be a one game at a time kind of thing. I'm still going to work on it consistently, but I'm definitely going to take my time with each video. I may even work on some smaller projects in between just so I can give myself some variety. Just a heads up. That being said, next time on the Zelda Retrospective, we'll be dying, according to a popular fan theory, and playing Majora's Mask. I hope I'll see you seeing me.